my name's Travis. I've been developing web apps for 15 years. I mostly work with a group called the Collab Cooperative, which is a worker-owned digital agency. And I'm really excited about a new piece of technology called Solid. So tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about what Solid is, and after this I just want to talk a little bit about what this group might be, and we can go from there. So this talk's called Solid 5 Ways, so there are 5 different ways that I'm going to talk about what Solid is. 97 slides, I'm sorry, it's going to go fast, I promise, but there are a bunch of things to talk about. And the first thing to talk about is the fact that Solid is really the World Wide Web. Ba-ba. And when I say that it's the World Wide Web, I mean it really is the once and future World Wide Web. The web was born out of a need to share information between scientists at CERN, which is a particle accelerator in Switzerland. It's a gigantic piece of amazing technology that lets us smash particles together and learn a lot about the universe. It was created because they just needed to share the data that they were creating with other scientists around the world, and they didn't have a very good way to do it. So a young engineer named Tim Berners-Lee put together this proposal for a hypertext media system that would allow them to do that. And it kind of blew up from there, to say the least. In the time that the web has been around, there have been 5 basic principles that have guided its evolution, and you can find these on the webfoundation.org homepage. There's a really good history of the web there if you've never checked it out. The first principle that the web has always followed is decentralization, which is to say that nobody should be able to prevent anyone else from posting something on the web. And, you know, this has succeeded to various levels. But broadly, it's pretty difficult to stop someone who's really determined from publishing something on the web. And in most parts of the world, it's pretty trivial to put something on the web if you want to. Non-discrimination. If 2 people connect to the internet with the same type of connection, their experience of the web should be the same. And there's plenty of discrimination around access to broadband internet connections, structurally and in lots of different ways. But we've done a remarkably good job of making sure that broadband users, or anybody basically the same class of connection, kind of gets the same experience. And this is what we call net neutrality. The third principle is bottom-up design. The idea that the web has been developed in the open by its users rather than being controlled by a small group of experts. And there definitely is a small group of experts that like have been very influential in the creation of the web standards. But when you look at what succeeded on the web, it is, for better and for worse, a kind of a mishmash of different innovations championed by different groups over the past 30 years. This one's, you know, reasonably successful, I think. Universality. All of the computers connected to the web share a common language. HTTP, URIs, HTML, JavaScript, CSS. There are other things on the web. Remember Flash? But these are the ones that we've spent a long time really trying to standardize and make consistent. And they've kind of tended toward eventual consistency. And any browser out there supports all this stuff. And we all kind of know what this is as web developers. And that's cool. And then finally, consensus. In order to ensure that universality, the standards for the web have been developed through a transparent participatory process at the W3C. And there's definitely a conversation here about how structural inequality in various world-spanning systems has made this really fall short of a consensus of humanity, like we really like, but we could do a lot worse than the way that the WCC has developed standards, and I think that's pretty cool. And so we created a World Wide Web, and it's been pretty cool, right? From the early days, we've had like lots of different people putting up lots of different things, mostly by people running HTTPD servers, which is just the original piece of software that served the web. And you know, a lot of really interesting things have come out of that. Lonely Planet for anyone who travels. This is probably my favorite website on the web. It's pretty cool, right?
Is it still around?
I don't know. I didn't even go to, what is it, satanic.org? Yeah. .org. But there's something missing. The very earliest vision of the web and the very earliest version of the Mosaic web browser, which is the original web browser, imagined the web as a space where anyone could easily publish content and data. supposed to be a collaborative space for all mankind. Cool. But when the first browser came out, they added multimedia, which is cool, you know, videos and pictures and all that stuff, and they took out editing because editing is hard. It's really hard. Being able to allow a, you know, basically unbounded set of people to add things to this like global namespace of information is a not insignificant challenge. But people still wanted to publish data, and so independent, you know, private companies sprung up that enabled people to publish data on the web without having to run their own servers, and that was cool until it wasn't, and until the company that was allowing you to publish data went away, or was sold, or decided you were the product rather than the customer. And this is the fundamental problem that they were trying to tackle and decided was too hard early on. You need, if you're going to let people write to the web, you need some control, some degree of control over who can write what. You can't just let anyone write anywhere, right? Because that sounds problematic. Which means you need some sort of idea of permissions, which means you need some sort of idea of identity. And the companies that have enabled people to publish on the web have done this. They've all solved identity and permission problems in their own ways, lots of different small, big ways. And they've created all these private domains of identity and capabilities kind of all over the web. You know, your identity on Facebook is very different than your identity on Google, is very different than your identity on Twitter. And your capabilities in all those spaces are totally different too. You know, what you're allowed to create, what you're allowed to read, are all different in those different domains, and they're all determined by the actual company that the space you're playing in. And as the web evolved, a small number of internet companies started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And their skill at building user experiences drew people who brought their friends. And the web started to sort of break up into silos. And because the internet's global, it enables network effects that pull the most influential people into the same places, which pulls everyone else. Which has led to the situation that we have now, where a small number of organizations have control over an enormous amount of the content published and are therefore stewards of the personal information of the creators of that content. And these high concentrations of data allow for sophisticated analysis of what we're most likely to click on, because that's monetizable. And the business models of the people holding our data are not aligned with our interests. And I think the oil analogy is apt. A small, wealthy group has gained control of a space created by and for the people of that space in order to extract a resource owned by that people, and made enormous amounts of money on it. And with the resources valuable, of course, less ethical actors are out in droves, to the point where there's an entire industry devoted to letting me know when my privacy has been breached and what I can do about it, which is essentially nothing. And so happily, there's been a wave of new privacy laws around the world, and that's awesome, and it's probably going to continue growing. This is an amazing post here, the 2019 privacy legislation bomb cyclone, and it's really worth reading through, especially if you work on the web, because the scale of the privacy legislation being considered around the world right now is really pretty staggering and really pretty good, but is going to dramatically change the way we all interact with the world and the web. But it's going to keep happening because people care now. This isn't like the early 2000s where nobody really knew what data privacy was. This was a poll from December, and 40% of the registered voters, I think this is just the US, said that data privacy is an important but lower priority. And 39% said that it's a top priority. And that's pretty wild, right? Either important or top priority. That's 80% of the people in the country think that this is an important thing. And this is just going to keep happening. This is just going to keep going because more and more people's data has been breached. And more people are realizing that there are real negative consequences to letting our data get out there. And people understand that as web professionals, and I'm talking about me here, that we're doing a bad job of keeping their data safe. And we need to do better. It's my favorite comment. Give you a second to read it. Take a drink. Okay, we're gonna move on. Gotta keep going. So Solid is a realization of the original vision of the web. It's a decentralized, standards-based way to let anyone publish to the web and maintain full control over what they publish. And this is Solid is the latest project of the folks who created the web in the first place. And so it's a broad international effort to actually finally come up with some solutions to these problems. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So the second thing about Solid is that it's decentralized. So there's lots of interesting decentralized web tech out there today. Some of it builds on the patterns of the original web and existing standards. But even in this case, software service providers, the people who run, is anybody familiar with Mastodon? Anybody have a Mastodon account? It's pretty cool. Imagine Facebook, but you can run your own Facebook server and it can connect to all the other Facebook servers around the world. But the problem is that anybody running one of those individual nodes still becomes a steward of the data that is created on that node. There's some decentralized web tech that builds on some interesting but still pretty new technology. And it probably makes most sense to think about a lot of the blockchain stuff as decentralized internet tech. Super interesting, but mostly orthogonal to conversations about decentralized web. And today we're talking about a decentralized web. But decentralized internet tech and decentralized web tech are super happy to hang out together. And there's a bunch of work right now going into looking at Solid on top of Safe, which is a basically just decentralized internet protocol that is built on blockchain. And that's super cool. Solid itself is a web standard developed through an open process at the W3C. And it specifies how to build a pod server, which is basically an HTTP server that hosts your data and makes it available to websites and services that you approve. If you have the expertise and desire, you can run your own pod server. But most people are probably going to choose to trust somebody else to host their pod. And that's great. Because this means that an ecosystem of providers are going to spring up and consumers will have choices about where their data and who to trust. Pods will be transferable between providers, so providers will live and die on whether they're able to keep their customers' data safe. And that's a fundamental alignment of interest that we don't have with the people who store our data these days. Yeah. Pod data will be stored in open standardized formats. And Solid, because it's a web standard, builds on openly extensible standards for defining data models. This is a cool quote from Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who created the original World Wide Web. And he's basically just talking about the fact that if you are trying to design something to be universal, you really have to let it go. So RDF was a W3C recommendation in 1999. And the basic idea, it's a data format that uses subject, predicate, object as its sort of core abstraction. Everything in RDF is a set of triples. And the first thing in the triple is the subject, and the second thing is the predicate, and the last thing is the object. So I mean, we all speak a language here. So, you know, we all took grammar at some point. The subject is the thing that we're talking about. The object, so they basically describe relationships. The subject is the thing that we're claiming has a relationship with something else. The predicate is the type of relationship, and the object is the thing that relationship is about. So this first triple says that Travis, I'm represented by this URI, and I want to be clear that it's not just that my profile is represented by this URI, I am represented by this URI. That's about me, the person, the physical person. So imagine trying to dereference that URL. The predicate is from a vocabulary called VCARD that describes contact information, and FN means full name. So this is saying that Travis's full name is Travis Vachon. The second one is saying that Travis has a knows relationship, which comes from the friend of a friend vocabulary, with someone named Toby Toberson. And that's RDF. Because RDF uses URIs for everything, application developers don't need to agree on common data formats. Anyone with control of a URL space can create their own ontology, basically a vocabulary that you can use to describe things, describe relationships, describe people, describe whatever. And there are a lot of vocabularies in existence because RDF's been around for a long time. And it's great if you use them, and people are super excited to collaborate on technology that uses the same vocabularies, but they're trivially interoperable. I can use terms from any of these vocabularies to describe relationships, to describe myself, to describe other people, to describe whatever. There are even sort of meta vocabularies that allow you to say, oh, well, actually, this thing from this vocabulary is the same thing as this thing from this vocabulary. And really smart RDF processors will be able to infer a lot of information about that. That's pretty cool. The second part of this is the linked data platform, which is basically an access protocol. And it was approved in 2015 by the W3C, and it's a formalization of sorts of some of the principles used by services that are serving RDF data over HTTP. The linked data principles are: use URIs to name and identify things. Use HTTP URIs, and I don't think I talked about URI here. A URI is basically a URL. It's the long string that you see in your browser sometimes, and they are sort of references to a global namespace. URIs are a little bit more generic than URLs, but for all intents and purposes, you really can think of them as URLs. So use URIs to identify things. Use HTTP URIs so that these things can be looked up, so that I can point my web browser at it and actually get something. That's pretty cool. And then provide useful information about what a name identifies when it's looked up using open standards such as RDF and Sparkle. Don't worry about Sparkle for now, for real. And then refer to other things using their HTTP URI-based names and publishing data on the web. And if that sounds like a lot or too abstract right now, I totally understand. Let's have another meetup and actually get into this stuff. That would be great. So what does this get us? Because solid applications will use these standardized universal data formats, vocabularies, and access conventions, you'll be able to grant new applications access to your existing data, and they should just work. This means that companies won't be able to rely on platform lock-in to keep users. If somebody doesn't like Facebook on Solid, they'll be able to build their own social network using the same data. Users on the new Facebook on Solid and their old Facebook on Solid friends will still see content as long as they keep playing by roughly the same rules. So Solid is decentralized. It decentralizes data stewardship. That is, it decentralizes who is responsible for our data. And even more importantly, it decouples data stewardship from app creation. It says the people that create the apps that I want to use on the internet don't need to be the same people that keep track of my data. And this is great for data owners because it means we'll be able to make separate decisions about who to trust with our data and what apps we want to use. Great. We're cooking through this. Slide 55 of 97. So the third thing about Solid is that Solid is private. And I think this is one of the most interesting things for a lot of folks because of the privacy thing that we were talking about earlier. And Solid is designed to dramatically improve data privacy capabilities. So this is from a book, it's one of my favorite books out there. This like, the author is this Finnish person who I think has like a double PhD in physics and computer science, and he just raised this like far future transhumanist sci-fi that really blew my mind. So a lot of these terms probably don't make any sense, but hopefully the basic idea makes sense. They're talking about this system on Mars for all these various transhuman people that actually stores their memories externally and has this like complicated permission system on top of their memories, so that like if I meet you, we can actually have like some sort of formal conversation about what from the conversation we're about to have we're both allowed to remember, and it's complicated. But this is actually a pretty interesting metaphor for this is the idea that keeps coming into my mind every time I think about the far future of Solid. We should be able to, with pretty fine granularity, specify what other people on the web are able to remember about us. When I use an app, I should be able to say, you can remember this information about me for 10 days, and then you need to forget it. And we should be able to enforce that with legislation, with enforcement, with big fines, and all the other enforcement mechanisms that have had a lot of success in changing internet behavior over the past 30 years. Because data privacy stewardship is super complicated. And we shouldn't expect reasonable people, or we shouldn't expect people in general to be very good at stewarding their own data. We need to enable the creation of businesses whose interests are fundamentally aligned with the users whose data they steward. These are just a few things you need to do if you're serious about storing people's personal information. If you're running an internet business and you're storing a bunch of data about people, you need to be good at securing it. You need to be good at helping people manage the privacy of it. You need to be good at preventing people from getting into it. When people do get into it, you need to be good at following up with them. You need to make sure you're complying with all the various laws in the places that you're operating in, and you really ought to carry some insurance against the losses that you're going to incur if somebody gets into your data and starts taking advantage of people as a result. And so, there aren't even many companies that really want to get into this. I would love to go start an internet company, but I don't want to do all this stuff. I just want to build some apps and provide value to people. It's going to be great. So by standardizing how personal information is stored, Solid can help us develop these proficiencies in a more concerted way. So how does that actually work? Alongside the development of the Solid spec, and sort of actually as a sub-spec at this point, there's a new spec called Web Access Control that lets you specify how, in a very REST-y, HTTP way, who has access to what resources on your server. And it'll basically allow users to create access control lists for individual resources within a user's data pod. Building clear and intuitive interfaces for maintaining these ACLs, the permissions, will be a core proficiency of pod providers. This is what the actual pod interface looks like right now, and obviously we're hoping to get better. But then fundamentally, pod providers will compete on how easy they make it for people to keep their data safe. By enabling organizations to turn their proficiency at data stewardship into their main business, will enable privacy regulators to go even further. Right now, the privacy legislation bomb cyclone is a huge headache for new and existing tech businesses, and it's not going to get any easier to be a data steward on the internet, and it shouldn't. It shouldn't. We need more stringent laws. We need strict audits and regulations for anyone who wants to store user data for more than, say, 3 days. We need professional licensing for data security professionals, the same way we have with architects and lawyers. We need better and more data privacy laws. And Solid can enable this kind of legislation to be passed without completely tanking the tech sector of the economy. Solid's going to allow us to make better decisions about who protects our data, and that's really important. So the fourth thing about Solid is that Solid is social. Solid provides an identity layer for the web. It gives you a thing called a web ID, which is a way to uniquely identify a person, company, organization, or other agent using URI. And this, unsurprisingly, also a W3C standard. So this is what it actually looks like. In the same way that you are able to log into other websites with your Facebook ID or your Google ID or whatever, you, in the future, will log into Solid Apps using your pod ID. Click on the link, pop-up comes up. You awkwardly have to pick a data provider. That's really kind of a weird UX thing right now, but eventually I'm hoping that we'll find some good ways around this. Actually, the real sort of longer term thing around this is that your browser will conform to the specifications that are coming out right now and actually store cryptographic keys locally that identify you. So it's going to change how we log into things in general. It's going to be a much better system in general. But for now, this is how it works. And it doesn't feel too much more painful, especially since there are really only 2 pod providers. One thing to note here, if you wanted to start your own website right now that used all this Solid tech, but you didn't want to force your users to create pods on either Inrupt or the Solid Community Pod, you could just run your own pod server locally, and you could store all of the data that you're creating in the pod server that you're running as a company. And that's why they have here identity providers that match the domain that you're logging in on in the default UI. Because that works now. You just want to go out and build an app that uses all this stuff and doesn't worry about the distributed pod ecosystem right now. It's possible. And what's cool is that a web ID, and this is my web ID right now, is a valid subject or object in RDF triples. So here is, again, the same triple that we saw earlier that says that Travis has the full name of Travis Vachon. So with all this stuff, Solid is kind of like a bare bones social network. It's already got the idea of identity. And there have been a number of vocabulary developed over the past 20 years that you describe relationships of the sort that you find on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And it is to the point where they're building some of this stuff actually into the Solid specification. Solid actually stands for social linked data. Linked data, again, is the data access protocol and set of conventions around RDF, and this is an extension of that that makes it more social. So this is some kind of basic information. Jimmy Wales is the guy who started Wikipedia, and this was a random piece of data in what they call turtle format. It stands for terse triple language, terse triple, TTL. And these are all basically shortened versions of triples. So this first one is referencing all of the things in this first block here are referencing the subject Jimmy Wales. And these are all facts about Jimmy Wales. And then at the very end, there's a kind of another triple set about something unrelated to the set, the earlier set, but helpful and useful because it identifies the thing that's talked about earlier in the document. And a lot of this is probably going to be incorporated directly into the Solid spec, which is still being developed. There's another spec from the W3C called ActivityPub, which is a web standard that's already widely deployed on Mastodon, and it'll probably be incorporated into Solid in some way, or into a lot of the Solid servers that people are going to build. At the very least, ActivityPub will certainly be interoperable with Solid because there's just too much alignment. It makes perfect sense. Social networks are fundamentally structured around humans. The core metaphors they use center individual people and their relationships to others. Solid stands for social linked data, and it adds a social layer to the linked data principles. Solid extends linked data by centering people, and that's, I think, why it's going to take off. This is an image from Ben and Jerry's. It's fun. So finally, and here's hopefully the most exciting part, Solid is a platform. It's a place, a thing that you can use to develop apps right now. So like I said, my interest in Solid comes in part out of my work with the Colab Cooperative. Our clients don't have big tech money, and I've been building web and mobile applications for them, but it's scary to me that when we build an app for an organization like the Democracy Collaborative, the Corning Museum of Glass. These are hilariously these are our biggest customers. But it's scary to me that we force these folks to actually become stewards of people's personal information. It's not their core proficiency. It's not what they're good at. There's no reason to believe that these folks should ever have to worry about storing people's personal data and worrying about all the various bad things that could happen. In the past couple of years, I've also been doing a lot more work with grassroots political organizing. And there are a bunch of interesting apps that I'd like to build in that space that generate data that should absolutely not be centralized and probably shouldn't even be, just cannot build them the way that we build these now. And I really, really, really want to be able to build interesting web applications for people doing important work on shoestring budgets. I really don't think that the ability to create useful web applications should be restricted to people with access to large amounts of capital. And right now, there's just no way around it. You don't have a lot of capital. There's no way you can become a data steward who's doing a good enough job to build it. And I believe Solid can make it much, much easier for the people to build useful applications on the web. With Solid, we can build truly serverless applications. The cost and risk of maintaining servers and stewarding data will be distributed to organizations whose interests are aligned with the users. And you can build apps on this right now. There are a number of options for JavaScript libraries that let you interact with a Solid pod from the browser. This is from the website of one of those libraries, and it just shows you 3 different ways that you can interact, basically 3 different APIs for interacting with a Solid pod from the browser. We'd love to get more into these in a future meetup, but for now we're just going to kind of breeze over that. The Solid community has created a React library that makes it easy to interact with a pod in a React application. They're literally just React components that you bring into your app and you can use and display or edit information in your pod. There's a company called Inrupt that was started by Tim Berners-Lee and some others to move Solid out of MIT research phase and into wide market deployment. And they published a React library that builds on React Solid, the one I just showed you, that adds even more kind of abstraction, more convenience, things like login buttons and all that. And Inrupt has also created a project generator to create a basic React app skeleton. The Solid project has published a list of apps that you can use right now to store and manage data in your pod. And I'm going to do a little demo. How do I get up here? Okay. Cool. So this is an app called Concept. There's this cool, weird, but there's this really interesting service called Notion out there right now. Some of y'all might use it. It's like a really nice little like wiki plus project manager plus calendar plus all sorts of different things. It's like it's the first time I've ever actually seen an online medium that felt almost as expressive as paper. And I'm terrible with paper, so maybe that's not a high bar, but for me it was nice. And so I created just a simple app here, an embarrassingly basic clone of Notion built on Solid. And I'll show you just a little bit of the code here. I promise this will be mostly not codey. This is where that mostly comes in. So this is a React component that just sets up a workspace. And interesting stuff happens. And this is a Solid app. This is how it actually works. We have a page drawer. We have a set of pages that are written out here. We pull data in from a Solid pod here using a tool called LDFlex that lets us specify a path to the data within our pod. And we use LDFlex in sort of a similar way to update that data. Oh, this isn't formatted in a way that makes it easy to demo. I wasn't really ready for that, sorry. So let me just show you how you can log into this. So when I log in, I know that my pod is on the Inrupt server, so go. And I can add a new page. Right. And so it does all the things that you would expect. You can delete things, all this. That's cool. And it's a little wonky. My hope, what I would love to be able to do here is actually use the same data model to do the kinds of embeds that Notion makes really easy. Like I want to be able to embed a reference to an object that lives in my pod, maybe a calendar. There are a bunch of vocabularies around calendars that let you kind of easily describe what's on a calendar and how a calendar works that we could use to actually just embed like a calendar in here or a task manager or something like that. But this is a shockingly small amount of code for what it does. It's pretty neat. All right. Happy to go over that more later. So that's open source, and I would love contributions. So if this is the kind of thing that gets you excited, or you just want to learn more about an actual working Solid app, hop on into GitHub and let me know and submit some pull requests. Oh yeah, this was me trying to be smart and set up a code thing here. And so, like I said, you can see where we're pulling the data in. I realized that I hid what's actually going on with this update, so it's harder to see what's happening there. But I promise you that is actually actively saving data to my pod. And that's pretty cool. Pull request welcome. I have a couple enhancements if you want to get in there. And the Solid community is ready for you to start building apps. There's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem with the Solid community. Interrupt has solved a little bit of that by creating a basic pod provider, but more advanced pod providers and the kind of choice and ecosystem that's going to enable a really different internet won't happen until we have a bunch of interesting apps that can actually use those pod providers. And those apps, you know, the really interesting ones won't happen until we have that ecosystem. So we need to kind of get in there and start building some fun apps and interesting apps. There are a lot of sharp edges, so if you do dive into this, be prepared to submit pull requests, debug the libraries you're using, and engage with the community. But that's fun. And those are my slides. So really the only other question is what's next for BASIC? I would love to start doing this once a month, once every 2 months. We were supposed to get t-shirts and stickers from the folks who, from Interrupt. I was in touch with them and they're excited about this and posted on their stuff. But the stickers and t-shirts never came in, so I'm sorry if they don't happen for you. But hopefully we can get them for next time. And thanks for coming. This is me. If you want to keep following along, feel free to check that out. That third one is actually a Mastodon server, so if you are looking for an excuse to get started on Mastodon, go for it. And yeah, any questions?